You may have noticed a new billboard at Richmond and Spadina saying First Nations are not getting a break on taxes, and that is a myth, a fallacy that many people think that Indigenous people, especially those who live on reserves, are getting an incredible tax break, don't pay taxes. It might surprise you to learn that, in general, Indigenous people in Canada are required to pay taxes pretty well on the same basis that you and I. Let's talk to the author of that billboard right now. He goes by the artist name Chippewar. Jay Soule joins me right now. Good morning.
Good morning.
What was the reason for that billboard? Why now?
Well, I think it's important, especially in this climate we are, with the recent acquittals of Gerard Stanley and the acquittal of the gentleman responsible for Tina Fontaine's murder, that in the wake of those, there was a lot of racist comments being thrown around on social media, on different forums, and it always circled back to actually being one thing that was being said. And I've noticed it a lot over the last 5 years as Indigenous issues have been in the spotlight. And the statement usually is, and it's worded in a few different ways, but essentially that Canadians need to stop using their tax dollars to pay for Indigenous communities.
I want to, and I want you to go to your Facebook page, Toronto Facebook. What's our Facebook? It's Toronto, BT Toronto. Go to BT Toronto because we have just such a short time to talk about it on air. But I want to expand on this, and I want you to talk with Jay. So go to our Facebook page. We're going to do a Facebook Live, which actually is starting right now. Let's talk about systemic versus institutional racism, and you're saying that we're almost conditioned as Canadians to be racist.
Oh, absolutely. There was a tweet I saw go out yesterday by author and playwright Drew Hayden Taylor, and he said, I believe yesterday was the 142nd anniversary of the Indian Act. So, you know, the Indian Act is a racist piece of legislation that's been designed, well, it is an assimilation policy, and that policy alone has guided and shaped the minds of Canadians for 142 years.
It's still called the Indian Act, yeah. which says a lot there. There is so much to talk about and so much, and I want you to, you know what, ask your questions, be free, be respectful, all right? Because I know Jay will be respectful right back. If you have questions, ask them and be frank about them, but be willing to have an open mind. So Jay, I'm going to hand you over to Mary Jane and Talia right now. So they're going to do it. Facebook Live is running right now on our Facebook page. You can just go off with them over to the big monitor over there, and please, go to our Breakfast Television Facebook page. It's quite an interesting conversation, one that we need to have in this country. Thanks for coming in, Jay. It's 7:15. Top stories. Here's Mel.
Good. So I wanted to ask you a little bit more. You've been fighting for representation with your work. Can you tell us a little bit more about the art that you do and the messaging behind it?
Well, I think my art is essentially Indigenous pop art with an Indigenous twist to it. I take pop art and indigenize it as a way of communicating with the youth.
Awesome. I'm familiar with your movie poster series. I read an article about it online. So can you tell those at home a little bit more about that series?
The movie poster series basically take iconic movie poster art and indigenize it. I think it's a great opportunity to really just show what it would look like these films through an Indigenous lens. So often Indigenous people are portrayed, you know, not in a kind light. So I thought it would be a good way, and very stereotypically portrayed. So I thought it'd be a good way to dispel some of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, I also have a little fun with some artwork.
What were some of your favorite movie posters that you did from that series?
One of the most recent ones, I guess, would be one called Terminator. Sorry. And basically, you know, for me, that one's really important because I think it shows, like, you know, when you look at the piece, it's, you know, he's half cyborg and still half Indigenous on the other side, and it shows, I guess, the struggle as Indigenous people of trying to live modern and live traditional, and the fight we have with colonialism and the fight we have, I guess, with the machine. So,
art is so important in political and social movements. What do you think? What other pieces are you fond of that you've worked on recently?
I can't really say one, except really the billboard that I've placed up. I think really most importantly to me, addressing institutional racism, as I think that's something that needs to be really looked at in this country. I think too many people are led by government, institutional learning facilities, media, etc., that guide and shape their minds. So I think it's really important that I can use my voice as an artist to help create the conversation and hopefully re-educate people about things.
You have such a platform with your artwork. There's so many issues that need to be dealt with, but what are the most pressing right now for you personally?
I think there's far too many to list, but I mean I think first and foremost the amount of Indigenous children in foster care and in non-Indigenous homes. I was part of the 60 Scoop, so I identify a lot with those children who have been taken from their families and are essentially being assimilated into Canadian culture. I think there's something roughly around 163,000 children in non-Indigenous care, which is far more than ever attended residential school and the 60 Scoop combined. So I mean that's alarming. You have the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. You have the disproportionate amount of Indigenous people in prisons and in jails. And then just to speak to the billboard that I created, I think this is a very important issue that people understand and Canadians understand that they're not paying. Tax dollars aren't used to pay for our living, and in fact, it's actually the other way around. We in fact have funded Canada. Canada is a wealthy country because of the theft of the land and the resources, and our people live in poverty because of how those funds are allocated to Indigenous communities.
Can you speak for those at home who aren't familiar with your billboard? Can you describe a little bit about the artwork and your inspiration behind it?
Well, the billboard's pretty large. It's around 16 feet by 12 feet at the corner of Richmond and Spadina on the south side. And I mean, I chose to do it really basic. It's red, black and red text with a white background, and it actually kind of fits into another piece that I did around 4 years ago. Stephen Harper had been quoted saying in the media that about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry that it wasn't really high on his radar, and that really broke my heart. So I created a very similar looking billboard that went up and stayed up on Queen Street West in Dufferin area, massive, really big, around 4 foot by 4 foot poster, and it basically just called them out about that, and I used the hashtag inquiry now. Fast forward a couple of years, to last year, I did another similar campaign that really looked at Canada 150, and I put out around 17 to 20,000 stickers across Canada, essentially calling out Canada 150, 150 years of genocide, 150 years of assimilation, 150 years on stolen land, etc. And all those first two campaigns are very similar. I've used the same fonts, I've used the same style to go along with the billboard, and that's fast forward to where we are today with this billboard. The idea behind it is really just to dispel the myth. Anytime Indigenous issues are in the media or in the forefront of a conversation, you always find people saying the same things over and over. And I noticed it 5 years ago at the beginning of Vital No More. CBC actually had to remove its ability to comment on their stories because of the amount of racist comments that were being put on there. And I noticed one that was always being said, and it was essentially that we need to stop using tax dollars to pay for these Indians. And it'd be said in some ways like that. Some ways it'd be said a lot harsher. Like one gentleman said, cut their hair, cut off the money, cut their hair, make them get jobs, enough for paying for these Indians. And it just isn't true. And more recently, actually, Duncan McHugh on Cross Country Checkup several weeks ago, I think it was around 6 weeks ago now, right after the acquittal of Gerard Stanley, he had a caller call in, and he essentially said the same thing. We got to stop using tax dollars to pay for these Indians. They need to go get jobs. That way they could take care of their women, etc. Duncan McHugh corrected him by saying, well, sir, you've just said, a whole bunch of sort of generalized statements that aren't really true. And it made me sort of think about what could I do as an artist to start dispelling this myth, and for Canadians to understand tax dollars aren't used to pay for us. It comes from a number of places, but it doesn't come from tax dollars, and that in fact we pay for you. Your luxury and your wealth is on the backs of Indigenous people.
Yeah. Do we have any questions online?
We do. So Deborah would like to know the best ways we can honor our Indigenous people.
Oh man, that's a hard question. I mean, I think the best way to honor Indigenous people is to support us in efforts, wherever it may be, whether it's land protectors and water protectors, or it's going in and helping support Indigenous causes when it comes to child welfare and the disproportionate amount of people and Indigenous people in prisons and in jails. And I guess really just get behind Indigenous people as much as you can and support us.
Mm-hmm. Changing the conversation.
Now, multiple people want to know where they can get that shirt because they love it.
Yeah, the shirt's available on my website on chippewar.com.
And one more, they want to know, again, just a reminder, where they can see the poster or billboard.
The poster is at Spadina in Richmond on the south side of the street. There's something, though, I wanted to touch on that I didn't really get a chance to say, and I think, just to give you a quick context of also what the poster was born out of is around like 3 weeks ago I was approached by a PR agency in Toronto to possibly take part in an anti-racism campaign that the government of Ontario is launching. And for around 35 minutes of that conversation, I was pretty much nailing the job. I was essentially, we were spitballing ideas of what that would look like. Essentially, the government of Ontario wants to launch a campaign that talks or puts a light on systemic racism through the Black community, Muslim community, Jewish community, Indigenous community, and they've chosen artists and representatives from each community to sort of shed light on that. And as I said, for the first 35 minutes, I was sort of nailing that interview. And then something sort of dawned on me, and I said to the woman interviewing me, "Do you really want me to be the artist who's going to speak out about racism when I hold the government of Canada most responsible for systemic racism through institutional racism?" And the conversation kind of went weird from there. From there, it just sort of like went downhill, and essentially, the brakes went on. She started backpedaling and trying to basically, I got talked out of the job. And pretty much my struggle is being able to separate systemic racism from institutional racism. I believe, we have systemic racism because of institutional racism. When you have policies like the Indian Act, that's 142 years old, that essentially is assimilation policy that in so many ways destroys the lives of Indigenous people. And then you have things like how the media, the government talk about Indigenous monies. And when they talk about it, I mean, even on March 14th, when they announced the new federal budget, they rolled money that's used in our communities into that federal budget conversation, which I think is wrong. And that's why I've chosen the hashtag not funding, because I think it's important that people understand that it's not funding. They are treaty annuity payments. They are land and resources payments. They are interest payments from a federally controlled trust fund. And when the government uses the word funding, it sends the message that Canadians are taxpayers are paying for that. So I think it's important, just to dispel that myth, and that for me, there's no way to disassociate systemic racism from institutional racism. You can't address systemic racism without first addressing institutional racism.
Cool. I just want a summary of all the other art you're working on right now to advocate for Indigenous rights.
For me, I'm really impulsive, so I think all of my work sort of touches on that. All of my work, really shows on different levels of what that looks like. So it's really an ongoing, never-ending sort of project.
Right.
Yeah.
But you're a tattoo artist also, and you have your billboard. Do you create clothing as well?
Yeah, so I create a full line of clothing that I make in my studio. I do all the screen printing in-house, and I have a huge variety of different shirts and stuff that I make, and
Cool. And if people want to buy this or check it out, can you remind them where they can see it?
It's www.chippewar.com.
Cool. Thanks so much for coming out today.